we're probably updating it every other day at a minimum. And if you go to the TCall homepage, same address that you've always probably bookmarked and used, you'll see this page. And then you'll come into a two links, one for the student page and then one for the providers. And if you click on the providers, you'll start to see today we even made some updates. We have added the new FAQ document, which is what we're going to be going through today. And then we also have some information on remote testing, and we'll talk about that later on today. And then if you go down a little bit further down, you'll see that we're starting to post a new section that we restructured today on serving students at a distance and remote instruction. And here you can find the guidance document on serving new students. This goes through many of the topics we'll talk through today. And then the PII document I mentioned, it downloads here in your tray, you'll see, and this is related to best practices in protecting information for students while you're working with them at a distance. And then some other nice pieces of information there for you. So check that out as you work on this topic and start to develop your local policies. And then I'll go back. Okay, I'm going back now to the FAQ document. This is the new one that we released a couple of days ago. And what we've done here, if you see ours, we've highlighted some things in yellow. Those are just the topics that we really want to spend some time focused on. And I'm going to move a screen over here so I can see the chat room. Okay. But we want to begin right down here and start with serving new students at a distance. And I wanted to just go through these terms. It starts about page 29. These are hyperlinks, so you just go in there and click on it. And Elena Zochman on my team did a great job of bookmarking this thing. But I think today what I want to focus on mainly is serving the new students information and then the performance related to that group of students.
Anthony,
So, yes.
I'm sorry, this is Michelle, but I can't figure out how to access the chat room. I don't see the chat box, and I don't know if any other people are experiencing there. It's normally a little bubble to say click and you just can put in your information, but now it's not available on my end. And that might be why
Okay.
The chat.
We're getting chats. There's somebody on there that's using this not as a with the Teams software. Can they describe how to find the chat for Michelle there? Thank you, Michelle. I was wondering the same thing myself.
Michelle.
So Fabiana's saying click on the. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, well, Fabiana says click on the ellipsis if you see one. I just put my mouse over my screen and this hover bar pops up. And once you have that hover bar, then there's a little caption window where it says see the conversation or hide the conversation. That should open up the chat pod.
Yeah, it only says that it said ask the team owner to make you a member. Only team members can chat. Ask the team owner to make you a member. That's what mine says.
Huh.
Yeah, that's a Teams thing, Deb. You can access it because you have the Teams software. But if you don't have the Teams software, you can't access the chat.
So all the people that are chatting all have that Teams software then. Okay.
Could be the case. So we can take the questions in audio then. It seems like people are being able to unmute themselves. So let's just do that. Does anybody have questions right now as we kind of settle into this? I see some questions on the guidance documents. Those are on the TCall website. I think we've provided that link. Deb did to the FAQ. Thank you, Deb. So yeah, click over to the TCall website, and you'll find that information posted that we're going to be going through. Okay, so let's walk through some of these things, and then I'll pause occasionally, and I'll be checking the chat, and so is Mahalia. But then we'll also take verbal questions on the call. So real quickly here, just so we're all sure we understand, but who are the new students served at a distance? And these are students that are served. They come to us and they don't walk into a center, and you're unable to test those individuals. So that's the cohort of these students that we refer to as the passes cohort. They're going to have unique characteristics to them because they're going to be served at a distance. So they may have inconsistent documentation because you weren't able to collect it. They may have electronic signatures or no signatures. It's going to be a less a complete enrollment cycle for these students, and we understand that. Since I think I'll say this up front, and then we'll talk about it more in the performance area, but I want everybody to let have your philosophy be, let's serve the students first and worry about performance second or third or fourth. I don't want people worried about compliance and performance at the expense of serving students. So if you're wondering, can I do this? I don't get a signature for it, or I can't collect this document. Can I serve the individual? Default your thinking to serving them first. And then we at the agency, at the executive level, understand that performance is something that's going to be messy, inconsistent, and greatly impacted during this period. So I don't want anybody thinking we're just treating performance as business as usual. It's not the case. It's been a big part of our discussion, but it's definitely something that I don't want it to be a chill on what you're doing. And I'm noticing that in other states because they haven't said that to their providers. And so the providers are saying, well, forget it. I'm not going to get a monitoring finding, or I'm not going to get, poor performance because I enrolled a bunch of students. And as a result, I talked to some people yesterday, and they have a national review of what's going on. They think that about 50% of the states are not accepting new students right now. So I think we're leading in that area, and I want to make sure that we continue to serve folks. So don't let that chill your feelings about doing this work. We've been through the new terms here, but I wanted to walk through the intake information. And actually, I was going to have Mahalia kind of take the helm here and walk through some of the new student information. So Mahalia, if you want to pop on, I'll mute myself to cut the airplanes out and give you guys a break. So Mahalia, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. Just like Anson, I've been having some connection issues today and have been
I can hear
moving around the house quite a bit. So this information, and we had gotten a couple things coming through the chat that maybe some individuals did not get the full packet that went out on Monday. So if you're missing that 6-page document that Anson's talking about that addresses serving new students at a distance, let us know and we'll get that out to you. In this particular document, and one of the things I really want to focus on in this particular section of the FAQ is really when we're talking about serving new students at a distance, that is, very specific, like Anson mentioned, to individuals who are coming into the system. So not your current AEL participants that may have been participating in classes prior to COVID-19, or possibly even returning individuals. There's information in the FAQ on that, which I'll talk about here in just a little bit. But we're really talking about new individuals that are coming in at this time, and sort of all of our traditional processes say, oh, a person comes in, we do this intake, we do this enrollment, we gather this information, and then we test them. And the testing is what we've always depend on to kind of determine this eligibility for an individual to be placed into a classroom instruction. So when we're talking about this particular section, we're only addressing those individuals who were not currently in classes and not currently enrolled in us. So as we're going through that, just kind of keep that context in your mind when we're going through some of these questions, and then the answers to them. So the first question here, I think Anson's already addressed. And again, if you have any particular questions, just unmute yourself and we'll answer those verbally. And get you some answers live here. Going down to the second question, and Anson, if you'll just kind of scroll as I go. So what happens if we are unable to administer an NRS approved pretest for a new student? How do we really complete that profile in Teams? Well, the good thing about Teams is that it doesn't require a test for you to create a profile for an individual. And the reason why we're asking you to go ahead and do that, even though you can't put them into a class in Teams, is because we want to have a mechanism to come up with a unique identifier so that you guys can protect student information when we're tracking them outside of Teams. So when you go in and you've collected this enrollment form, you've collected the Pearl information, you really have all that you need to create a participant record and a profile in the system. And so that step of the student enrollment and intake process, we want you to go ahead and complete in Teams. So you'll go ahead and do that. So, and again, ask questions and interrupt me if you guys have any real questions about that. So a couple of other ones here we wanted to highlight and just kind of go through. So Anson, if you'll move down to question 3. This one is about eligibility for those new students that are coming in. Again, we've always heavily relied on testing for that. What we want to make sure that people understand is that the true eligibility for AEL really hasn't changed. It still has to be individuals that are considered out of school. They still have to be 16 and up. And if they do fall within the ages of 16 to 18, which is that compulsory attendance age, you still have to have that additional documentation available that person is in fact out of school. And that is all defined in an AEL letter that we have out already and that you guys have already been using forever in terms of how to collect age-related eligibility for those individuals. We've got some additional information in AEL letter 0520. And this is where we went back to the original language and aligned our language back to original statute that basically says to be eligible for AEL services, 16 and up, out of school, they are basic skills deficient, they lack a high school diploma or a secondary school credential or its equivalent, or they're an English language learner. So those things in terms of how we are determining eligibility haven't changed. What's changed is the how. Because before, the how was always determined by what? It was always kind of determined by this pretest. And we've kind of always lived and died by that. Now we're having to come up with this new term, which Anson brought up earlier, which we are coining as staff determined eligibility. So Anson, if you'll continue to scroll there. And I see a question from Nadine. It says some schools may be closed and withdraw unavailable for youth. We have in the process, and I want to say it's 0517, Fabiana can double check that, for an AEL letter. We put this out, I think, a couple years ago that gave you options. So if you couldn't get a withdrawal form, you can basically ask the student to self-attest to that information. You just have to create a local form that asks them a series of questions so that you can determine that they have, in fact, withdrawn from school. And we did that purposefully because every single school district has different processes and policies in terms of what they required for a student to be withdrawn. So we said that's too hard to manage when we're kind of dealing with a bunch of different kind of fiefdoms. And so we said, in order to be eligible, you have to basically ask a series of questions, and then you guys determine if they're in fact withdrawn based off of how they answer those questions. So Nadine, look at that AEL letter, and then if you have any other questions, follow up through the AEL TA box, and we'll be sure to get you some specific information that may just be related to your particular instance there. So I want to talk about determining eligibility without a pretest, and kind of take some time because I think you guys may have some real questions on this particular topic. And you'll notice, for those of you who have had time to look at the TWC transmittal that Anson sent out on Monday, we included in there a tracker for these new students that are coming in, that basically the only thing you can do in Teams or Teams related is create that profile and create that participant record, but you can't add them to a class because they don't have that pretest. There is a column on that tracker, and we'll probably pull this up a little bit later, that's going to basically ask the staff to determine what bucket of eligibility that these individuals fall in based off of the information that you are gathering through the intake process. So again, we're going back to what is that federal requirement, which is basic skills deficient, lacks a high school diploma or a recognized equivalent, or they're an English language learner. Most of this information is available to you through the filling out of an enrollment form. It's going to be available to you through the collection of the Pearl elements and how they're really answering those questions. So they're telling you a lot just in that enrollment period and through that intake process. And what we're asking you to basically do is to utilize that information to put these individuals into eligibility buckets. So this question number 4 here is really the guidance that we're putting out on that. And Anson, do you want to scroll down just a little bit? So we're basically here, we're saying you've got some tools at your disposal that staff should really be utilizing and looking at, and creating a local process in how you're going to do this staff determined eligibility. So one of them, of course, is the enrollment form, like I just said. The enrollment form includes all types of information: highest grade level completed, whether or not they've obtained a secondary diploma or its recognized equivalent. It asks them if they're an English language learner. What I want to do is just really get back to basics here. And this is something that for new students that are coming into our system that aren't familiar, they're not returning students, they don't understand. But those of you who have been doing intake for a while, you know the nuances of the Pearl. And what I mean by that is sometimes the questions on your enrollment forms, they're just not intuitive. So if a person's coming in and you say, are you an English language learner? Well, you need to make sure that they understand how we're defining that. So those are going to be some things that I think are going to be important. So you want to make sure that if you're doing a completely online option for them to fill out like an intake form or an enrollment form, that you have that information available to them that's going to be a crosswalk for them to really understand when they're answering those questions. And the reason for that is because we are asking you to use this as a tool to determine staff determined eligibility. So enrollment form is a great resource for you. Also, one-to-one communication. If you're talking to an individual and right away you're like, okay, reading, speaking, writing in the English language, I can classify probably safely this person as an English language learner. So you're going to have to really kind of develop in this process some ways that you will be determining where this individual lies in terms of the eligibility process. Anson, scroll down a little bit. So the other one that we're having here is a non-NRS approved test. And many of you have sent in some questions throughout this process to say, well, can we use this? Can we use that? And what we're saying is, sure, you can use that for the term of wanting to figure out if this individual is basic skills deficient. There's a lot of other non-NRS approved tests out there that you could probably provide to an individual remotely or online, get those test results and feel safely that that person would be kind of in this bucket of basic skills deficient. So even though we may not be able to utilize that as a true baseline when we're talking about performance purposes, you certainly can use those as a staff determined eligibility tool in your process. So I'm going to pause for just a minute because that's probably a lot of information, and see if there's any questions anyone wants to ask. Or is everybody with me?
Mahalia, can you hear me, Lewis?
I can hear you.
Great. When we do a non-NRS approved test, does that still prevent us from putting them into a class, but helps us to determining what class they will eventually go into?
Correct. Correct. And it serves kind of two purposes. And I'm glad that's a really good question, Lewis. And we talk about this later in the FAQ as well. So one thing is really determining if we feel like this person, if we did have a test, an NRS approved test that was available and we gave it to this person, they'd probably fall somewhere within a range that they would be deemed eligible. That's one thing. The other thing, which you just hinted on, which is really about class placement and instructional needs for an individual. So you definitely can use these non-NRS approved tests. And one thing I do want to bring up, so you can put a non-NRS approved test into Teams. There's actually an option in there, and I think we're going to actually show that a little bit later. So you can put them into Teams. It's just not going to allow you really to enter that person into an actual class based on a non-NRS approved test.
Let me go ahead and show that real quick here if I can find it.
So if you guys choose to use that in a local process and you're as an option for, this sort of staff determined eligibility, you can certainly put that into Teams if you want. And you can see here, like on your assessment screen, you basically, when it asks you to choose an instrument, you're just going to say teacher determined or informal. That's where we're going to ask you to just kind of click that. And that's just going to denote to us that you did provide some sort of some sort of test prior to an instructional time for the student or placement of the student. There's a lot of other tests in there as well in that drop down, but that's kind of where we're asking you to put those non-approved NRS tests.
Okay, we got another question from Sergio there in the chat. Can you see that, Mahalia?
Yes.
Mahalia, this is Michelle. Can I ask a question as well?
Sure.
So once all of this, when we get back to being, I guess my question is the end goal, will they eventually take an approved assessment in order to put these hours into Team, or is that not even the goal? I guess I want to know what the actual end goal is for collecting information outside of Team.
Yeah, and we kind of address this a little bit as much as we can a little farther down, but really the goal right now is just to serve individuals that are coming to us in need. The bottom line is we really don't know. We haven't gotten any direction from Octane in terms of a performance perspective for any of this. We have certainly been in communication with them to express our concerns. I mean, the weedy details of it. And they're very aware, but we just haven't received like any formal guidance in terms of how we will go about, reporting any new students during this time that we're basically unable to test. And like Anson said, you've got about 50% of the states that aren't even enrolling new students. So for locally, I think the focus is just on serving individuals, which is why we're asking you to track them, because we're trying to stay a couple steps ahead. But the bottom line is right now, I don't know if the time between a non-approved test and the time when we get to remote testing options online, I don't know if any of that contact time will ever be able to go into Teams. I don't know. That's just something that we're going to constantly be reaching out to Octave to get some guidance on. But the goal in terms of creating the participant record and creating this profile and doing this external tracking of these individuals is so that we have something that we can then take and say, look how many people we served, and put it on Octave to kind of say, and you're not going to give us credit, or you are, or what's the stance there? But we need the data. So we need the data to kind of, help us to make that case in the end.
And let me add a few pieces to that. It's a very good overview. And good question, Michelle. It's been a lot on our mind. I'll begin by saying, don't let the performance drive your behavior. Let's get the students served. And I didn't say this, but I'm anticipating a lot more people coming to adult ed because they're becoming unemployed. So we really want to get ready to start serving more people, because typically when you become unemployed, you go back to school to get your skills up, get your high school equivalency. But I think we're going to see several kind of different subsets of this PASSIS cohort of students. So there'll be some that will come in. You might give them, an online test through Aztec or through another software. You might give them a GED ready. You might just admit them and not think about a test initially. And then one scenario is those students go through, and then all of a sudden, it's June, and your classrooms can open at your institution. That might happen very inconsistently across the state, where some schools will never open in the summer. Some colleges have already said they're not going to have summer programs. And in some places, community-based organizations and others may open. And then those students will come in, and they could take a test, and they could take a TABE test or something. And then they'll become a regular student, but they may have 30 hours already. Another group of students may take the TABE test online, and then all of a sudden they become more treated like a regular student. And that group will be out there. There'll be some students that start, they never test, and then they leave, and we never see them again, and they don't test, and those students will just not enter teams at all, most likely. But we'll have them on this PASSIS tracker Excel tool, and we'll be able to report that to our leadership and to other people. There's a wide variety of these little scenarios, because during a very turbulent time, student behavior is going to be very inconsistent for many of the students as they're bouncing around, looking for jobs, dealing with other crises that come up in their households that they need to prioritize. So think about that too. We're going to be flexible, and we're asking you guys to be flexible also, but also to tell us what you're seeing happening out there, because that's really important for us too. I'll turn it back to you, Mahalia. Thank you, Michelle.
So good questions, though, from both of you. And those are things, we're just going to continue to have to, peck away at here at the state level. So any more questions before I kind of move on a little bit here? We've included some things in the FAQ that you can see that are kind of what we're saying that we think will be kind of these good points that you will know in terms of eligibility in this intake process. You can get the student's age from the intake form. It's one of the reasons why we really didn't want to veer too far away from what we traditionally have done, because if there's any way for us, in the future to utilize this information, then we want to have the capability and we want to have that information available. So school status at program entry, entry. If the individual indicates on the enrollment form again that they're an English language learner, those are all things that you can use to determine staff determined eligibility at that time. And that's going to help you to fill out the tracker, you know, after you've sort of gathered that information. Anson, if you'll scroll down, there's a couple of other questions or a couple other points in here that we kind of go into a little bit more detail. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not going to read it to you, but I want to point that out, that if you have some questions about, well, what do you really mean by one-to-one communication? How can we utilize that? We did go ahead and put some of those, you know, trying to be as preemptive as we could to answer your questions, put some of that information in the FAQ. So be sure to kind of read over that section as you're working on your processes locally. Continue to scroll there, Anson. So the next question here, number 5, will TWC provide a form for self-attested eligibility? So the first thing we want to say is that we've moved away from this term self-attested eligibility, and we've now started calling it staff-determined eligibility. Because the self-attested eligibility has a lot of just historical use, in particular with people ages 16 to 18, because they are basically, we've created that term for them to self-attest to withdraw from school or out of school status, and also whether or not they meet an exemption in terms of homelessness, in terms of whether or not they live separate and apart from their parents, and things like that. So we started calling it staff determined eligibility. So it doesn't have to be a TWC issued form. Now I will say we're going to work on doing a TWC form. We've kind of shied away from this in the past because so many institutions like to add some additional questions on their enrollment process and in their enrollment form. And so we've been very, you know, we wanted to be as flexible as we could. So you need to continue to use the same Pearl elements that we've always used, that we've always required for your enrollment forms. All of that information should still be on there and be collected. But at this time, that is still on you guys to develop a local form. So serving high school students, we've got this question here. So obviously we have a lot of high school students that during this time are kind of like, man, maybe I just won't go back. I have one of those, you know, teenagers that thinks he knows everything. So we have, it's basically, the question came in, it says, can we serve these high school students who have basically left school because the school's closed down and they've just decided, I want to get my high school equivalency instead of doing the remote learning through the local school? Do they have to wait for the school to open or attend summer school, or can they come through us? And what I'm saying there, and the answer to that is, if they formally have withdrawn from the school and they meet sort of all these requirements that we have, I think it's an 0517, then yeah, you can serve them, because you're basically determining that they are considered out of school. So you always want to make sure that the student does not intend to go back to school, because the local school districts will work through their withdrawal, and they need to formally recognize that with their local school districts and follow whatever that process is, so that the school districts locally know that they are officially withdrawing. But then in terms of receiving services for us, then that can go through all the outlines in the process listed in 0517.
Okay, let's take a little break here and get questions. I got one from Gracie Pequeño in Brazosport College. She says, if we complete the self-determination to admit a student, will that student still need an approved test once the tests are available remotely? Thank you, Gracie, for that question. My answer for this would be yes. Soon as we start to be able to have capacity to do tests, we need to be able to start doing those, because then you're kind of transitioning back into your standard services, and you want to try to get them back into teams and get them into our system and out of this other process that we have. So I would kind of make that process built into my thinking. We don't want these students to go forever without assessments on our NRS approved tests. That being said, I think that transition is going to be slower than we would like and choppy. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to be able to administer, a TABE test to, 25 people in a room. It's another to administer remotely one-on-one or in very small groups a TABE test once that becomes available remotely. So you may end up with we talked about this with the GED testing service yesterday. We're going to end up with these bottlenecks where we have a lot of students, say 50, 100, 200 students, and we need to give them tests, and then the tests become available, but it's going to take us a lot longer to move people through that process. Plus, there's some other challenges related to can the students' computer at home do the test? Does it have the right operating system? Do they have a camera for that? And this gets us into the topic of remote testing, which is not the topic of this call, but we're in that discussion. But the short answer to you, Gracie, and everybody else is, yes, we'll want to test them, but it may be less quick than we think as we start to have those options available to us. The best bet is, of course, our brick and mortar services become open and we could start doing those things online. And one thing I would ask everybody, in person, I would ask everybody to think about this also. If you're at a college or school district, there's a very good chance you're not going to open up this summer. And if you do, it's going to be, for essential services, your college testing lab, if it opens up at all, is going to focus on TSIA tests and those types of things, not giving TABE tests, not giving Best Plus exams. If you're a GED testing center, that may be the case also. So if I was a college or school district and I'm thinking we're not going to open this summer, but other people might open up, like my local workforce board or a community-based partner or a library, I might start thinking of how could I do testing not on my campus, but somewhere else that is open, should those places become open. Because if you could box up, a bunch of TABE tests and Best Plus tests or Best Literacy tests and take them across the street or across the down the road to somebody that's open and start scheduling students over there to take tests, that could really relieve a backload of testing that we might be experiencing once we get into this messier phase of going back into brick and mortar services, because I don't think it's going to be smooth for every institution or the same. So that being said, thank you, Gracie. Other questions either on the phone or the chat? I'll look in the chat, but I'd be very happy to take them. We really want this to be your time to ask us questions.
Anson, we missed a question from Sergio a little ways back up in the chat pod.
Yes.
You see that one?
That seemed I can go through that. That seemed more of a comment to me. Sergio was saying that their process, if I can find this here, it's not showing up in my chats.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, if you got it in front of you, you can read it, please.
Yeah, it says, in the past, assessing has happened before assigning to tutors, but in this new process, can we assign them to a tutor and they can assess them?
Yeah, I read that. I saw that. Thank you, Sergio. And that process is fine. That's a local process. And if you typically don't assign tutors until they have a test, you can flip that sequence of things. Thank you, Lori. I saw Donnie, I'm assuming from Weatherford, saying he hadn't seen the 6-page guidance yet. check with your manager there, your director, because that should have gone out on the 13th to all the grant recipients, Donnie. And now it's on the TCAL website. So look for that on the section on remote serving students remotely.
Anson, I posted that in the chat pod as well.
Okay, great. Other questions? Verbally, if anybody wants to unmute. Donnie's got it. Great. Okay, Fabio. Go ahead. Okay, Mahali, we'll turn it back to you now. Or was Sergio going to chime in? Sergio, you there?
Yes, just in regards to the serving high school students, just really quickly, I know we already discussed about the option for doing the self-attestation form, but are we basically saying that as long as the student says that they withdrew, even though they were enrolled for this semester, and the high school system may not be able to recognize that withdrawal immediately, you're saying we can still serve them as long as they say on the self-attestation form that they have?
Yeah, and I'll answer that the best that I can without actually pulling up the guidance, because I wrote that a long time ago. But basically, through this self-attestation process, we require that you guys ask them a series of questions to determine their current enrollment status through their local district. So I think some of the questions are related to, are you currently enrolled in school? Do you have plans to return next semester? Do you have plans to continue? Like there's the series of questions that you're required to include on this self-attestation form to basically get at answering one question. And that one question is the student currently enrolled in secondary school, or do they have any intention to being enrolled in secondary school in the future? So that's kind of, and all of that helps to really just determine their out of school status, whether or not they're considered in school or out of school. And again, every district has sort of a different process. Some of them just say if they've missed so many consecutive days, we just withdraw them and they're considered withdrawn. Some people make the students go through a formal process of withdrawal through the district. So we've heard back from several kind of districts around the state. So Sergio, I would do some local research for wherever you guys are located and kind of see what the actual formal withdrawal is there locally, and then compare that to the guidance that we have out. And if you feel like, hey, if I have the student fill out this form and they're not going to go back and they enroll in our services, then I think you're going to be safe. And that's kind of what we worked out with our local general counsel here at the state level.
Okay, thank you.
Good clarification. Thank you. Okay, let's move on through here. And Mahalia, you got the helm again. Let's see where we had some more questions we wanted to highlight. Was there something you wanted to go to, Mahalia?
If you go down, I think it's question 8 under here. Yeah, go back up a little bit. Actually, it's right there. So people were kind of this notating a participant's academic level. Somebody had sent in and said, we need guidance for where staff should notate in team the participant's academic skills or educational level when you're determining this eligibility piece that we're talking about. So there's really two things I would suggest. One, you're going to put it on the tracker. Once you've figured out this is our process, these are the tools we're going to use to determine what bucket this student falls into, whether that's a non-NRS approved test, whether that's we're going to review the enrollment form and we're going to utilize that information to help us to determine this. There's really only a couple of places in Teams. If you actually wanted to make a record in Teams, which I would just really recommend that you guys have that as part of your process. So there's two options in Teams where you can have an open comment field. And one of them is going to be on the participant profile. There's this little thing, and Anson's showing it right now on the screen. It says additional information not indicated. And you can that's just an open text field. So you can utilize that as an option to say, we gave a non-NRS approved test, student is, staff determined eligibility, whatever you want to do. And then the second option there is going to be under the personal information. This is another open text field. It's 500 characters. So you could put something in there. And this is going to help you, again, going back and trying to look out 6 months from now and kind of going back into Teams when we get back to, more traditional ways that we've done things. Being able to quickly identify students that you've had to go through this staff determined eligibility with that don't have, a standard NRS test. So those are the options that you kind of have if you want to further document things in Teams versus documenting them sort of externally through something that you've created. You have flexibility there, but I just wanted to kind of show you guys what those options were in Teams. We actually have a bug in right now because I would love for us to be able to do case notes in Teams. So that'll be a future enhancement for us.
Okay, thank you. I had a quick question here from Debbie Alfred down in Brownsville ISD. Thank you, Debbie, and appreciate your Twitter posts. Those are very exciting to see. Her question was about technology purchases. Will guidance be given or supporting the purchase of laptops for teachers? We were told today by district administration that all purchase orders are on hold because the warehouse is full and they don't have enough manpower working right now. We were hoping to use the Q3 funds, performance-based funding just released to us. That's a difficult one. We're going to be updating some of our letters and make sure that in our guidance on the release of these funds, we say that this is related to an emergency and that there should be some priority to purchases made with these funds, because we had some other questions about schools saying, well, the management won't let us order things because they don't think our order is a priority because of the pandemic, and they're prioritizing only pandemic purchases. So we're going to put language in our policy letters about that. Your situation is more about just a local challenge with staff in the warehouse and working, and that's going to be a harder one to address. I don't think we can address it except for putting some priority on these funding. But we have heard this question also because, school districts especially are locked down, and only like the cafeteria workers are serving lunch, via drive-through lunches. But the main offices in many places are locked down right now. So I think that's something we're all going to struggle with. I think in the summer, what I want to position everybody for is when your finance offices, purchasing staff, and others do go back to work, that our purchases are flagged as emergency purchases, and you can try to squeeze those to the front of the line. Remember, there's going to be a lot of people trying to get to the front of the line. But that is going to be something that I think you'll want to really consider. Other options, I'm not suggesting this is, the option that everybody can do, but if you had the ability, if especially you're a consortium and you could grant your money over to a consortium member who may be open, that might be a way to kind of leverage their ability to do a purchase by giving them the money and letting them do that. So some of you might have that flexibility. Again, you're still having to go through contract amendments and transfers like that, which can be difficult when the finance offices are either closed or they're backed up with all kinds of other emergency purchases. Good comment, Debbie. Thank you.
And I'll just add, because we probably want to switch over. There's a couple other sections within the FAQ we want to go over with you guys, but for Michelle, and those of you who were asking questions about like NRS and kind of some performance things, there is a section at the end of the FAQ. I think it's called testing and remote testing that kind of answers the where we are right now, which is yes, we're saying you can use these non-NRS tests for purposes of placement or instruction, but we don't really know the outcome. Right now, our guess is that no, these aren't going to be able to count for like a standard pre-test to determine a baseline. So you can find that there at the end of the document. So I just kind of wanted to point you guys to that guidance.
Thank you. And so this is where this will be our new area of growth. So start to look for this. But I will say I don't think these tests like the GED Ready and stuff, they're not going to be NRS approved tests. I think the Department of Education is going to lean on the test publishers to just open up remote options for existing tests. That being said, our priority at TWC for your performance is get the students in. And if you want to test them on these things, please do it because it does help you define curriculum, identify a level, those types of things. We'll worry about the performance later, but I am not expecting a miracle on remote testing anytime soon because of some of the constraints I've mentioned earlier. So let me go back up to the performance section and talk a little bit about that. This first question is not a new one. It's on performance related to COVID-19 pandemic. And this is from Adam Leonard. And essentially, it's what I've been telling you, which is it's too early to know what's going on. We know it's going to be impacted. We're looking at the situation, but don't worry about it. Let the services go forward, and then we will work with you on performance as we move forward. Also, if you're, I want to bring this up, if you are a grantee like Accelerate Texas and you need an extension, I think we've taken care of everybody, but those things are going to be impacted also. But let's talk about planned gap a little bit because that's something that we've talked about before. But Mahalia, reemphasize the planned gap. It's not necessarily for new students, but I think it's an important thing to underscore again.
Yeah, so we're transitioning, I think, for probably the rest of the call, unless we end up have time to go back to the tracker, from sort of this new students and that classification of students, which is our passive students that we've termed, versus, current students or students that may have been enrolled prior to COVID. And maybe, in need of a planned gap. So I just want to spend some time. We've got some questions in about that. So the question is, should programs be utilizing basically the planned gap to help, during this extended break for students? And that's an option that's definitely available to you. A couple of things just in terms of policy that I want to go over with the planned gap. The way the planned gap works is, number one, if your student has transitioned to remote or distance learning and they are getting contact time, planned gap is not something that you can utilize for those students. Planned gap is really for students that have come to you and said, hey, during this time or for the next 90, 100 days, I'm not going to be able to participate in remote or distance learning for these reasons. That would be but I do want to, at some point, when you reopen your classes in the future, I am interested in coming back. Okay. That's what a planned gap is for individuals that are going to be gone for more than 90 days, no direct hours, no proxy hours, no training hours, but they have an intent to come back. And the planned gap is something that has to be updated in Teams every single month. So you're going to have some sort of way to stay in contact with this student. It can be a phone call, it can be an email, it can be some sort of communication where you say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and put you in this, suspended break or whatever you want to call it locally, for the next 30 days, and I'll follow up with you in 30 days. because you have to do that every single month in teams in order to continuously extend that plan gap period. And again, it's going to be for people that are going to be gone and not getting any contact time for more than 90 days up to 180 days. So that's sort of the way the plan gap works. And if you want a little bit more information on that and how a plan gap works in terms of a period of participation, you can see AEL letter 0119. But this is really just to prevent an exit for a student. So again, the key there is that the student has an intent to come back to services, but because of circumstances right now, they're unable to do so. So if y'all have any questions on that, kind of be thinking through that. Some of you are using Plan Gap regularly. Some of you don't use it at all, but it is an option.
Okay. So let's look at some of these questions on contact time. This one here is a common one we've gotten. I'll do a couple of these and give Mahalia a break. When will direct hours start for new students served at a distance without an approved test? And so we're saying for the PASS's cohort of students who are utilizing remote learning options, regardless of if they have a test, they'll generate direct hours in the usual increments that we've always used, and we'll enter them in the PASS's tracker, which we'll look at in just a second. Anytime above 7.5 minutes rounds up to 15 minutes of contact time. And we don't know yet how those students will be counted for performance. And then new students and enrollment targets. And this is one that we really worked on quite a bit. Again, we don't want to worry about performance, but we did want to address the concerns because you guys are so focused on enrollment targets. And I appreciate that, but we need to not be obsessed with it right now. The question was, when will new students served at a distance count towards enrollment targets when they don't have an approved baseline test? So what we're saying right now is we have basically a period here where we're giving folks kind of like a focus on just service delivery. But that being said, testing and assessment is critical for what we do. And we want to make sure that as you serve students, you are doing some sort of assessment on them using some of these other tools. But until an NRS approved test becomes available, that we can't use any of these tests to substitute for a baseline or a pretest. And we've given some examples of those. Another question was on incomplete information, and I kind of referenced this earlier in terms of, students come in, then they disappear. So the question was, what are performance impacts if a student served at a distance does not complete the enrollment form? Baseline test never makes it to face-to-face services. We're saying we're still monitoring the situation, and we'll recommend to the commission how we'll deal with those types of students, whether we can actually ever count them towards anything. But I can tell you that, and I'll talk more about this on the biweekly call tomorrow, but our commissioners asked me yesterday and asked us that we start reporting on increases in services or services in general more formally. So we're going to start asking for questions on that. We had some questions here on persistence problems, which are pretty much the same. But I wanted to move us into the information on the PASS's tracker instrument and turn it back over to Mahalia. I see a question here from Kathy Dowdy at ACC about remote tests. We have not approved the best approved remotely yet. And that is only because Lori Slayton and some others are working on kind of a policy framework. We need a policy per the Department of Education guidance on how Texas is going to administer the Best Plus and other tests. That's hopefully going to be something we get out next week. And we'll be able to cut you guys loose with a little bit of guardrails around how we're going to do it as a state. Don't expect any kind of big restrictiveness or anything put on by us. but we definitely wanted to show you that we're moving forward with that. Another question, should new classes be created in teams to reflect the startup of remote classes? Mahalia, I'll let you address that. We have a question in there about renaming classes, but should they name new classes in a unique way? My first response on that is we're going to look in teams for sure, and Mahalia can correct me if I'm wrong, but we'll be able to say, like, as of we haven't picked the date yet, but it's probably going to be the date after spring break for most people. We'll draw a line in performance and say, after this date, we are in the pandemic officially in terms of service delivery, and any students that come in that are new, any classes that are created will fall into this separate category of performance that will have a different consideration. And then, of course, the continuing students that didn't post tests and all that, they will also kind of fall into that area. So, Mahalia, did I get that right, or is there something else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point and a good way to kind of frame this up. And to answer Suzanne's question, so this is really local flexibility, and let me say that, because the reason I say that is because when people transitioned into remote learning, some of them just basically said, here's a brick and mortar class. This is the instructor for that brick and mortar class, and now we're transitioning that class to this remote option. And really nothing really changed in terms of a data entry perspective. Nothing really changed in terms of how that information goes into teams, because the participants and the instructors are kind of remaining the same. And then we've got situations where people had very limited teachers that could do remote learning, and so those teachers have taken on additional students than what they may have been, in charge of originally. So you have some flexibility there. If you have this remote learning option that's available and you're having to essentially create a new class that's going to have different participants in it, may have a different instructor assigned to those participants, then of course feel free to reflect that into teams. You can do that. So it's really, you have some flexibility there, I think, locally, in how you want to do it. Like what Anson said, we're going to be looking at any contact time after a certain period of time, and we're just going to kind of plant a flag in the sand, and we're going to say all the individuals served after this time are through a remote option. And that's how we're going to be looking at it from a state perspective. So I don't know if that helps you, Suzanne, there locally, but it's just every place has been so different in terms of how they've been able to transition to remote learning. I don't want to say you have to do it one particular way. I think that you're going to want to develop something that makes sense for you, and make sure that you're able to track the direct hours and the proxy hours and the training hours in teams for all of your current students that transition to remote classes.
All right, great. Let's we got 15 minutes left here, and let's move over to the tracker and really dive into this. And remember, this is for really the grant recipients will have control of this, and they were the ones that had this sent to them. I'm going to let the consortia leads determine how they want to implement this with their local providers. But we did want to show people kind of what's coming and what it looks like in terms of usage. So Mahalia, take it away.
And Anson, so I want to start off by saying, so there's 3 different tabs on this tracker, and the tab that you're looking at right now is the actual student tracker, and this is going to be your class level information. And so you'll notice at the very top that all of these corresponding columns at the top really reflect back to things that we have determined are necessary during an intake and also just a class level participation period. So I've basically included all the information and columns across the top here that you will need if in the future you want to go back and create a class in Teams. Since we're a little unsure of what the future holds in some aspects, I just wanted to make sure that we're collecting everything so that we have the capability. So Anson, I'm going to ask you to select the third tab on there, which is the instructions tab. So the instructions tab is going to be a breakdown of each column, and then we've provided a description there to kind of help you better understand the information we're wanting you to place into the tracker. So grantee name, provider name, those are set up that when you select your grantee name, when you go to select your provider name, it should only be the providers that you currently have in Teams. That's how we built it. Of course, a little bit of student information. The one thing I will say about the tracker, and this goes back to us requiring you to create this participant profile and record in Teams, is because I didn't want any PII on here. Because for those of you that have sites all over the place, large consortia, we wanted to create flexibility that you can put this in a Google Doc. You can put this in somewhere that's, probably less secure because there's no PII on here. Nobody's going to get anything from this. So we wanted to make it very accessible, for you guys. But on the instructions tab, you'll see there's a couple of places here: enrollment form signed, release of information signed, compulsory attendance. That's going to be for those individuals who are 16 to 18 years of age that don't already have a high school diploma or its equivalent. So every single column that you see, there's going to be a corresponding piece on the instructions tab to kind of help you go through this. So you kind of have everything there for you, but on the actual tracker itself, you'll notice, Anson, if you'll go to the coursework tab, we've tried to create the drop downs just as they are in Teams. So just like if you were filling out and completing a new class in Teams, if you click the drop down in coursework, you're going to be able to select the corresponding coursework that eventually will be built out into Teams. Same with the distance learning models and the distance learning curriculum. When you select the model, then you're going to have in the next column, which is the curriculum associated with the model that you selected. So we've really tried to do this, and hats off to Christine Long, because I'm all vision and little Excel skills. So she really did a great job helping me kind of bring the vision to life here on this. So it's pretty simple. It's that way intentionally. There's not a lot of, big stuff built in here, so that you guys, if you want to then create additional local processes for your class, meaning your contact hour level information that you're going to be collecting on students for the daily hours accrual, you could probably easily build this back into this spreadsheet. That's why it's kind of made this way. Anson, real quick, if you'll click on the summary tab for me. As you go through and you're starting to fill this information out, the summary tab is basically going to auto sum the information that you're putting in there. So you'll be able to see the total number of students as you're filling this out, the total number of students that don't have an enrollment form, assigned enrollment form, or assigned release of information form. Then it's going to start to break down your students by the month they were enrolled. And that's to help you and to help us, because we are going to ask you to submit this to us. Every single month, I think, is what we're leaning towards. So it's kind of take the place of a monthly data validation or a data sign off. We're just going to ask you to submit this to us every month so that we have some sort of sum of students that are coming into, new students that are coming into the system that we may not see in Teams. So questions on the tracker in particular that anybody that anybody had. I know we only got about 8 minutes here. And I did also include an activity or fund code. And Anson, if you'll click on the instructions real quick, I wanted to just go over that piece here. And for those of you on the call that may be Accelerate Texas grantees, just know that I'm working with Ann to do something very similar for you guys. If you'll notice on the instruction piece here, there's an activity or fund code. And then if you click on that link, Anson, hopefully it works. If you actually just click in that cell, what it's going to do is it's going to take you directly to this attachment that went out into for AL letter 0120, which lists out all the fund codes. So we didn't put it in a drop down because different grantees only utilize specific fund codes. Some of you utilize a lot of them, some of you not as many. And so we wanted to make this a little bit more specific. So in that particular column, you will be utilizing these fund codes, and you will just, type in whatever fund code is applicable for that student.
So I would say, as we get questions, and let me switch back to the tracker. Thanks again to Christine Long. Many of y'all have not met her, but she's just a fabulous individual in our division that has helped us put this thing together. But as you look at this, and I know some of you are already thinking this, but one of the guidance pieces we put in, as you read through this stuff on serving new students is get a local process together. If you're a consortium, build a process for your subs. If you're not, build a process for your program, because imagine the sheet with 300 people on it. And then one day, you're going to need to make sense of all this stuff and report it and start transitioning people into teams. If it's a hot mess, from the beginning, you're going to have a lot of problems rectifying and kind of making that transition. So I definitely want to remind you of that, because we're in an emergency, so you want to move fast, but well begun is half done on these kind of things, I always say. Kathy Dowdy asked, will the summary need to be submitted to us every month, or will the whole sheet? Mahalia, what say you?
Well, I don't know yet. I think I need to probably think about that and keep in mind some of our large consortia that we have. It may be quite a bit of information. I think for us, I probably would want to ask DOI, Anson, and just get with them and kind of say, what level of information should we, do you need? Or do we need to be able to go and kind of make a case for certain things at the state level and at the federal level? So likely, Kathy, I would plan on having to submit all of it, which means that if you have multiple providers and they're working off of separate sheets, that there will be some consolidation there.
Okay, we got some other questions. Good response. And I would say in response to that, you might get a request from me for an ad hoc on the summary for sure. If for some reason someone, elected official or somebody, asks how many students have come in their local area, mid-month or something. So Risa Wingfield from Literacy Council of Tyler out there, hi Risa, said, will the passes tracker macros be affected by uploading into Google Sheets? That's something I don't know. If Christine Long's on here, she may know, and you can chime in, Christine. But probably the best thing to do is try it out and see what happens. I don't know enough about the impact of macros on Google Sheets. Does anybody that has deep expertise or lessons learned know that answer?
Yeah, if Christine's on, she could probably. We tested this in Google and uploading it to the cloud and uploading it into Google just to make sure that it was still kind of usable and multiple users could access it. We didn't have any issues. But I don't know if specifically we tested it if you actually tried to, open it and put it into like a Google Doc.
Yes, I'm not sure. I have more success in the desktop app.
This is Keegan from Amarillo. I do want to say that thankfully we use Google Drive a lot, and I will say thankfully Google has updated their platform so that you can work within an Excel document and you don't have to convert it to the Google Sheets format. So as long as you keep it in that Excel format, I've seen that it will continue to work, but I did notice as soon as you convert it to the Google Sheets format, you do lose a lot of that formatting. So that would be one thing to watch out for.
Great feedback, Keegan.
Thank you so much from Amarillo.
Abel.
Abel.
Yeah, quick question. So what I'm hearing is that using the tracker in the future, when we're able to test these students, the test date at that point will determine the first date of contact for direct hours. Not
Possibly.
when we put them on the tracker.
That's the questions that we kind of all have in our brains, and that's sort of what we're trying to figure out at this point. So that's a good question. It's a question that we've been asking for, I think, about 4 weeks now, and we don't know. We just don't know.
And we don't
know. I mean, the feds may come back and say, hey, states, you tell us how you want to do this and develop a plan. I mean, we just don't know. We haven't gotten any enough feedback to be able to come up with a plan for Texas. One thing, and Lori answered this. So this new student tracker, this is only for new students. So for current students that were already in a brick and mortar class or already involved in distance learning, you want to continue to track those individuals and teams. Don't skip a beat. Just keep that rolling. This is just going to be for new individuals coming in that you can't give them an NRS approved test to put them into a Teams class.
So the intent to reprogram team to allow students contact hours to be entered prior to an assessment date is not an option.
Probably not. And a lot of that has to do with our federal reporting. When we do all of our federal reporting, every student has to be in a level. So all of our reporting is based off of students, them being in levels. So even if we remove the functionality from Teams, which I can tell you would be a spider web to untangle, and we are looking at other options, but in order to just do our basic federal reporting, we have to assign these individuals to an NRS level. That's more of the hang up than anything Teams related in terms of changes.
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we're at 3:00, and I'm going to keep running this because there's no reason why we can't. So we got some other questions. If people need to log off, that's fine. I understand. Is there a way, Michelle Lamons out of Amarillo, is there a way to turn off the function in Teams that inhibits recording direct hours until C19 has passed?
Well, I think that's kind of goes back to Abel's question too. Yeah. And again, everything that happens in Teams, I mean, we can do whatever we want in terms of the system being pliable. It's just time. Yeah. But the real caveat is that we wouldn't be able to report these individuals because we have to assign them to a level when we report them. Yeah. So the need for the test in order to put them in a class in Teams, we could change the business rules there, but it's not going to help us in terms of counting them as a participant because they still wouldn't be counted as a participant until we have a mechanism to get them into a level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another question from Christine. Robinson at HCC about this being housed in Teams. The tracker, I'm assuming, it will not be. This sits outside of Teams. And then there was another question from Evangelina Benavides. Should we backtrack and update the tracker with participation from last month or just going forward for April? My answer, and Mahalia can enhance it, is it's all dependent on if they are a new student. If they're a new student, yes, they need to go into this. So if you have a group of students, you just started letting them in, you've got no record of them in Teams because you couldn't enter them into Teams, then you would want to go back and kind of start to collect the enrollment information and all of that and put them in Teams. If they're an existing student, then they can already be in Teams, and that's fine. Mahalia, any enhancement to that?
No, I think that covers it. I mean, we basically, today's April 15th, obviously. In terms of giving you guys a general timeline, I think by May 15th, we're going to want you to submit all the new student tracker for any new students that have come into the systems for March and April. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Anson will be sending out like a TWC transmittal with some official kind of ad hoc deliverable for that. And we've already sent out a TWC transmittal that talked about the monthly data validation extensions and the data sign-off extensions. So even though we've extended those, just know that we want you to continue to enter your data entry bi-weekly, monthly into Teams for current students, and then we'll probably be asking for this new student tracker to be completed for March and April by May 15th. If that seems to be a little unreasonable, you guys can give us feedback on that. I can't imagine there's just, thousands of brand new students in the system already, but maybe there are. So you guys can kind of give us a test on that one.
Sergio had a question. Are you exploring the option to create something similar to the tracker, but within Teams, like the way we do adding students to waiting lists?
Yeah. And I'll address that. Oh, well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we have we created this because we couldn't get it put into Teams electronically because we have so many other things in Teams getting worked in for July 1st in terms of enhancements. Mahalia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'm not taking it off the table for an enhancement we may want to do in the future. We never know when something like this is going to come up again, so I'm always trying to, be 5 steps ahead. Our plate is pretty much full in terms of Teams enhancements all the way through December of next year. But, the only option right now, at least in my brain, if we wanted to try to create this in Teams, would be at the class level, which means when you guys go to basically create a class in Teams, you would have to designate it at that time as being a non-NRS reported class or something to that designation. And I think in the past, that probably hasn't been done because people would start utilizing the systems for non-AFLA funded purposes, and it just kind of clogs things up in terms of, AFLA funded programs being able to use it and things like that. But, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. It's definitely not something on the agenda, though, for probably, this year or moving into next year.
Denise Johnson from Harris County Department of Ed said, can we create a COVID-19 code to add hours that students required prior to actually taking the pretest?
Yeah, and the issue isn't the coding, it's you cannot physically add a student to a class to even code them. You can't register them for a class without a NRS approved test.
Mm-hmm. Ambry Wiedner asked about the Best Plus, and Lori answered about it going remote. Boy, I really feel the heat on for this, so I'm going to work on the policy with Lori. No, I understand, and I appreciate everybody's eagerness there. We just want to kind of get a little bit of structure around it so that we have a process and a policy here. But my goal would be Monday morning, you're going to see something in your inbox related to that. So I'm going to put that on myself to work on with our testing experts. Michelle Lamont, would TWC consider adding a passes checkbox that would bypass an assessment score?
Yeah, that's kind of like what I was talking about with basically a non-NRS class. I mean, and that would just get us to a point where you guys would not have to track this on an external spreadsheet. You'd be able to put it in Teams, but it would not help us in terms of the performance piece.
Okay. Anybody else have any verbal questions out there that they'd like to share? Okay, looks like we might be getting ready to end things up. I'll let it go for a little bit longer. Lorraine is asking, can we clarify the DSO information?
So Anson had sent out a transmittal, and I'm sorry I don't have the date. Anson, if you have the date. So Anson sent out a transmittal, and basically what we said is that the data sign-off that was due today, we were extending that, and we weren't requiring the data sign-off for quarter 3 to happen today. And the reason for that is because we know that people got sort of removed from their businesses, and closures were happening, and they don't have access to files, and they don't have access to student information that took place in March before we transitioned to this remote learning option. And so we basically just said, instead of doing a data sign off and validating a bunch of classes, and then for us to have to go back and unvalidate classes to try to do end of year cleanup, we just extended the monthly data validation. So monthly data validation is extended until further notice. And then we basically took away the quarter 3 data sign-off requirement, because those kind of go hand in hand. And so those are being extended.
Thank you very much, Mahalia. Let's see here.
Anson, this is Ann Savino. I just wanted to add, I was seeing Christine answer something on the Google Docs issue. I'm not sure. She says she has more experience in the desktop app. I just wanted to add, when I uploaded the document, I always worked in it. I downloaded it to the desktop in the app. So I don't know if the new edition that Keegan was talking about would enable you to use it with your macros or not. So that's my feedback on that.
Mahalia, there's a question from Marisa. The self-attested form we currently have will now be called a staff eligibility form, ?
Well, that's hard. That's difficult for me to answer.
Yeah.
A lot of local programs call just the general enrollment form a self-attested form, because it is. You're basically giving it to an individual, and they are attesting to the information on there and kind of signing off on it and saying, this is true and correct to the best of my knowledge. So in that term, in that context, we've always kind of referred to everything that we collect in AFLA as self-attested. Because we don't ask them to bring in documentation for every little piece of information that we collect on those forms. So all we're saying right now is that we're moving away from this NRS approved test as being the true determiner for eligibility, and we're saying that staff can determine eligibility based off of that form. So I don't think you need to change anything locally. I think it's more of just a understanding that you're going to be utilizing that form to kind of take the place of this NRS test at this time. I don't know if that helps at all, but
seems to. Okay. Anybody else?
And I saw that Michelle had a question about how will this external tracker help with performance. And I don't know if we have an answer. I mean, we basically are going to be utilizing the tracker so that we have some solid data on how many students have come into the system that we are unable at this time to get performance on in certain things, like for our federal performance. It also gives us flexibility to go back and say, what do we as a state, meaning our state level performance, can we give, some sort of exception to? It just is, it's going to allow us to just have more data so that we can make recommendations to our state level leadership as well as with our federal partners to kind of say, this is going to be the impact and this is what Texas has done. We've continued to serve this many individuals during this time. And then it allows us to kind of ask for what we want. If we don't know and we just say, well, we're continuing to serve, more individuals, but we don't really know if that's 10 people, 10,000 people. If we don't have a number, it's just going to be very difficult to make those negotiations, I feel like.
Okay, I think we're pretty much done here. I appreciate everybody's feedback, and I appreciate the questions for sure. As you roll this out, you're going to have a lot more questions, and please send them in to us, and we will be evolving our FAQ and our detailed guidance because we're all kind of in a new territory here, and I expect things will be a little inconsistent at first, but I think we got a really healthy start. We don't want to get in your way. We want to bring value and help answer those questions quickly. And I want to thank my team for everything. Mahalia and others have just been fantastic. The TCall team and getting everything updated has just been fantastic. But you guys are the ones working with your staff. And we'll try our best to make sure that because you're not sitting in front of your computer on our stuff all the time, you're probably working with your classes and your teachers a lot. We'll try to make sure we remind you multiple ways if something very important comes out, like the remote testing guidance. So we'll make sure to get that information pushed out to you several different ways. But I want to thank everybody. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for your contributions to Texas and to your students out there in your communities. We're signing off now. And we'll leave this running for a little bit in case people want to chat.
Just wanted to say thank you. Just say it.
No, thank you too.